Imagine opening your front door to find a wild 350-pound lioness staring you in the face. She isn't growling, she isn't attacking, she's knocking. Heavily pregnant, poisoned by poachers, and in premature labor, this apex predator has walked miles to find the only human she trusts. What followed next was a heart-stopping 12-hour battle against death inside a remote cabin that shocked the world and created a bond that defies every law of nature. You are not going to believe how this ends. But before we dive into this incredible roller coaster of emotion, please take a split second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out and ensures we can keep bringing you these jaw-dropping lion stories. Now let's head into the South African bush and start our adventure. The silence of the South African bushveld was never truly silent. It was a deception, a held breath waiting to exhale. For Sarah Miller, this acoustic landscape was the clock by which she set her life, a life that had become increasingly defined by the spaces between sounds. It was 6 in the morning, and the rising sun had just begun to bleed a deep, bruised purple into the eastern horizon, threatening to turn into the relentless, bleaching gold of the African day. The air was cool, holding the last shivering remnants of the night, smelling of dry grass, red dust, and the pungent, sage-like scent of wild basil disturbed by the waking wind. Sarah stood on the wraparound porch of the outpost, her hands cupped around a ceramic mug of black coffee. The heat from the ceramic seeped into her palms, a small, necessary comfort against the morning chill that seemed to settle deeper in her bones with every passing year. She was a woman of 62, her skin mapped with the lines of a life lived under the harsh sun, her hair a steel gray tied back in a practical, no-nonsense knot. She took a sip of the bitter coffee, the liquid scorching her throat in a way that felt grounding. Her eyes scanned the tree line of the reserve with a habitual, predatory focus. To an outsider, the view was paradise, a sprawling, untouched Eden where giraffes moved like slow-motion pendulums, and zebras painted chaotic stripes against the beige grass. To Sarah, it was a beautiful, lonely fortress. It had been 5 years. 5 years since the radio in the kitchen had crackled with the frantic, distorted voice of a junior ranger, delivering the news that would shatter her world into irreparable shards. 5 years since David Miller, her husband, partner, and the only man she had ever loved, had succumbed to a massive heart attack while fixing a perimeter fence in the heat of the day. They had come here together 30 years ago, escaping the sterile, gray confinement of the city, trading concrete for red earth. David had been a wildlife veterinarian, a man with hands gentle enough to suture a bird's wing and strong enough to wrestle a sable antelope. Sarah, a veterinary nurse, had been his right hand. They had built this life, this outpost, brick by brick, sweating over the foundation, laughing over cheap wine by the fire. They had planned to grow old together, sitting on this very porch, watching the cycles of the wild play out before them until they themselves became part of the dust. Now, Sarah watched alone. The grief was no longer a sharp stabbing knife that took her breath away. It had calcified, becoming a dull, constant ache, like an old injury that flared up when the weather turned. She kept the outpost running, maintaining the solar arrays, monitoring the waterholes, and reporting to the main headquarters. It was a penance, perhaps, or simply a stubborn refusal to let go of the last piece of David she had left. Every loose board she nailed down, every logbook entry she made, was a conversation with him. She turned to go back inside, the solitude of the morning weighing heavily on her chest. The isolation was a physical weight today, pressing down on her shoulders. Just as her hand touched the weathered iron handle of the screen door, she heard it. It was not the roar of a lion, shaking the earth with its base. It was not the whoop of a hyena, nor the chitter of a monkey. It was a sound that didn't belong in the wild symphony of the bush. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching. Distinct. Deliberate. Wood against claw. Scritch. Scritch. Pause. Scritch. Sarah froze. Her instincts, honed by 3 decades in the bush, screamed at her. Scratching meant an animal was testing the perimeter. A leopard, perhaps? Looking for a way in? A honey badger? Aggressive and hungry? Looking for scraps? She set her mug down on the railing, the porcelain clicking softly against the wood, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet morning. She reached for the heavy flashlight she kept by the door, a habit from the night shifts, though the sun was already providing enough light. Slowly, cautiously, she unlatched the heavy wooden door, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. She expected a scavenger. She expected the bristling snout of a warthog. She did not expect the mountain of gold that collapsed onto her doormat the moment the barrier was removed. Sarah gasped, stumbling back, her boot catching on the doorframe. Lying there, filling the entire width of the doorway, was a full-grown African lioness. The animal was massive, easily 350 pounds of apex predator, a creature designed by evolution to kill. But she was not attacking. She was broken. The lioness looked up, her head heavy, dragging against the wood. Her amber eyes were wide, glazed with pain and a terrifying, intelligent desperation. Sarah knew those eyes. The recognition hit her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and replacing it with a cold shock. "Zara?" Sarah whispered, the name falling from her lips like a prayer. "Zara?" The memories flooded back, unbidden and overwhelming, flashing behind her eyes like a reel of film. 7 years ago, David had brought home a shivering, dehydrated cub, found abandoned in a ravine during a flash flood. Her mother had drowned. The cub was days away from death, nothing but ribs and matted fur. Sarah had taken the creature in. She had mixed the formula, warmed the bottles on the stove, and spent sleepless nights on the living room floor with the cub curled against her chest, listening to the tiny, thrumming heartbeat. They had named her Zara. They had raised her for 3 years, walking her through the bush, teaching her to hunt, protecting her until she was strong enough to survive. It had been the hardest day of Sarah's life, second only to burying her husband. Watching Zara walk away into the scrub, looking back only once before disappearing into her true life, had felt like abandoning a child. And now, she was back. But this was not a social call. Sarah dropped to her knees, ignoring the primal voice in her hindbrain, screaming that this was a wild animal capable of tearing her throat out in a millisecond. She reached out, her trembling hand touching the lioness's massive head. The fur was coarse, dusty, and alarmingly hot to the touch. Zara did not flinch. She leaned into the touch, letting out a low, shuddering moan that vibrated through the floorboards and into Sarah's knees. "What is it, girl? What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking. She moved her hand down the lioness's neck, feeling the rapid, thready pulse. That was when she saw it. The lioness was not just sick. She was heavily, impossibly pregnant. Her belly was distended, tight as a drum, rippling with the violent movements of unborn life. But it was the other symptoms that made the blood run cold in Sarah's veins, turning her fear into a focused, icy dread. Zara was panting, but the breaths were shallow and ragged, catching in her throat. Thick, white foam flecked her black lips, dripping onto the wooden porch in sickening globs. Her gums, usually a healthy pink, were a stark, ghostly white. Her pupils were pinned to tiny black dots, unresponsive to the shifting light. Sarah's medical training kicked in, overriding her shock. She had seen this before. David had treated it a dozen times, usually with tragic results. She could almost hear David's voice in her ear, listing the symptoms: pinpoint pupils, salivation, muscle tremors, dyspnea, aldicarb. Sarah hissed, the word tasting like ash and bile. Poison. It was a poacher's weapon. A cheap, highly toxic carbamate pesticide used to lace meat, left out to kill vultures, hyenas, and lions silently, so the gunshots wouldn't alert the rangers. Zara had eaten poisoned bait. The neurotoxin was already ravaging her system, overstimulating her nervous system, paralyzing her lungs, drowning her in her own fluids. But the horror didn't stop there. Sarah looked at the lioness's swollen abdomen. The muscles were contracting violently, spasming in waves that shook the great beast's frame. The poison was forcing the lioness into premature labor. Sarah realized with a jolt of clarity exactly what was happening. It was a realization that brought tears to her eyes. Zara, in her agony, feeling her body shutting down and her babies coming too soon, had remembered. Through the haze of pain, across miles of hostile terrain, she had remembered the safety of the outpost. She had remembered the hands that had bottle-fed her. She had walked, God knows how many miles, fighting paralysis, fighting death, to knock on the only door in the world that might open for her. She wasn't just begging for her life, she was begging for her children. "Okay, okay, Zara, I've got you," Sarah said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "I've got you, girl." She stood up, her knees cracking, and ran to the radio mounted on the wall. She grabbed the handset, her thumb jamming the transmit button. "Base, this is Outpost 4. Emergency. I have a poisoned lioness at my location. Urgent. Over." Static. A hiss of white noise. Sarah stared at the radio. She twisted the dial, checking the frequency, sweat breaking out on her forehead. "Base, do you copy? This is Sarah Miller at Outpost 4. I need a vet team immediately. I have a code red." Silence. Just the mocking crackle of dead air. She looked out the window. In the distance, over the ridge of the mountains, the sky was turning a bruised, angry black. Clouds were stacking on top of each other like anvils. A thermal storm, a black southeaster, was rolling in, the kind that ionized the atmosphere and killed radio frequencies dead. The satellite phone would be useless too. The heavy cloud cover blocked the signal. She was 4 hours from the main camp by jeep on a good day. With the storm coming, the dirt roads would be flash-flooded within the hour, turning into impassable rivers of mud. Even if she could reach them, no one was coming. No helicopter could fly in this. Sarah turned back to the door. Zara had not moved. She was lying on her side now, her legs twitching uncontrollably, her breathing becoming a terrifying wheeze. If she stayed on the porch, exposed to the elements, the storm's temperature drop would kill her, if the poison didn't kill her first. Sarah looked at the lioness, then at her living room. It was a sanctuary of civilized life. Persian rugs, bookshelves filled with paperbacks, fragile mementos of David. Bringing a wild, poisoned, birthing apex predator inside was madness. It was suicide. A scared, pain-maddened lion could kill her by accident with a single swipe. Zara lifted her head. She looked at Sarah. The connection was electric, transcending species. It was the look of a mother who had run out of options. It was a look that said, "I trust you." "Damn it," Sarah whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek with a dirty hand. She moved with purpose. She grabbed an old, heavy wool blanket from the sofa, one David used to wrap around his legs in winter, and rushed to the door. She couldn't lift 350 pounds, but she could drag. She tucked the blanket under the lioness's heavy shoulders, grunting with the effort. "Come on, Zara. You have to help me." Sarah grunted, gripping the corners of the blanket. She braced her boots against the doorframe. "You have to move, girl." Zara seemed to understand. She dug her claws weakly into the wood, splintering the finish, pushing with her back legs. Sarah pulled, her muscles screaming, her back straining. Inch by agonizing inch, they crossed the threshold. The smell of the lion, dust, musk, and sickness filled the small entryway. Sarah hauled the lioness into the center of the room, onto the thick rug in front of the unlit fireplace. As soon as the lioness's tail cleared the doorway, Sarah slammed the door shut and bolted it. Outside, the sky cracked open. Thunder, loud as artillery fire, shook the cabin to its foundations, and the heavens unleashed a torrent of rain that hammered against the tin roof like 1,000 drumbeats. The storm had arrived. Sarah was trapped in her home with a dying lioness. There was no vet, there was no backup. There was only Sarah, the ghost of her husband, and a promise she had made to this animal 7 years ago. "I won't let you die," Sarah said to the room, to the lion, to David. "Not today." The interior of the cabin had transformed into a surreal field hospital. The power had flickered and died 20 minutes ago as the storm severed a line somewhere down the valley, leaving the room bathed in the eerie, fluctuating glow of 3 battery-operated camping lanterns. The shadows danced on the walls, stretching and twisting, making the labored breathing of Zara seem to fill every corner of the space. The rain battered the roof, a relentless assault that isolated them from the rest of the world. Sarah knelt beside the lioness's head. The smell in the room was intense, the copper tang of blood, the musk of a wild animal, the chemical bite of disinfectant, and the ozone of the storm. Sarah's clothes were stained with sweat, charcoal, and grime. She held a large plastic turkey baster in her right hand and a mixing bowl of black sludge in her left. Activated charcoal mixed with water. It was a crude remedy, but it was the only one she had. "Swallow, Zara. You have to swallow," Sarah commanded softly, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. She pried the lioness's jaws apart. The teeth were massive, ivory daggers capable of crushing a zebra's spine, but the jaw muscles were slack, trembling with the neurotoxin's effect. Sarah inserted the bastard deep into the throat, past the rough, sandpaper tongue, and squeezed the bulb. Zara gagged, her body convulsing. For a second, Sarah thought the animal would bite down, severing her hand at the wrist. She flinched, but didn't pull away. The lioness's throat worked, a ripple of movement, and she swallowed. The charcoal would bind to the toxins in her stomach, acting as a magnet for the poison, hopefully preventing more of it from entering the bloodstream. It was a race against time, biology against chemistry. "Good girl," Sarah soothed, stroking the velvet fur between the lioness's ears, wiping away the foam that still gathered at her lips. "That's a good girl." Sarah's mind was racing, accessing files of information she hadn't touched in years. Atropine for the heart rate, fluids for the shock. She had found a bag of saline in David's kit. The plastic bag dusty from disuse but the seal intact. She had managed to find a vein in the lioness's foreleg, shaving a patch of golden fur with a disposable razor and inserting the IV catheter. It was a clumsy job, her hands out of practice, but she had taped it down, and the fluid was dripping. Drip, drip, drip. A metronome of life. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, aching melancholy. Sarah looked at the lioness, at the swollen belly that housed the future. "I never got to have children, Zara." Sarah found herself speaking into the dim light. The words tumbled out, unbidden. It was a conversation she had only ever had with David, and usually only in the quiet dark of the night, whispered into pillows wet with tears. "We tried. For 10 years we tried. David wanted them so badly. I wanted them. But my body, it just wouldn't work. I felt like I was broken." She stroked the lioness's flank. "David used to say that we had thousands of children. Every antelope, every rhino, every lion we saved. But it wasn't the same. I know it wasn't the same for him." Zara let out a sharp whimper. Her body tensed, her back arching off the rug in a violent spasm. A contraction. A big one. Sarah snapped back to the present. She moved to the rear of the lioness. The labor was progressing too fast. The poison was acting as a cruel accelerant, the body trying to purge everything in its distress. "I'm here," Sarah said, her voice switching from confessional to professional. She grabbed clean towels. "Push, Zara. You know what to do. You're a mother. Nature wrote this code in you." The first cub came 10 minutes later. It was a wet, slippery bundle of fur, sliding into the world with a rush of fluids. Sarah caught it, her hands gentle but firm. She quickly cleared the membrane from its nose and mouth with her finger. The cub cried, a high-pitched, mewling sound that cut through the thunder outside like a razor. "He's alive," Sarah breathed, tears stinging her eyes. "He's alive, Zara." She placed the cub near Zara's head. The mother, exhausted and poisoned, still possessed the instinct that was older than the mountains. She lifted her heavy head and began to lick the cub, her rough tongue massaging life and warmth into the small body, cleaning away the birth fluids. 15 minutes later, a second cub arrived. A female, slightly smaller but vigorous. She squirmed in Sarah's hands, tiny claws already pricking the skin. Sarah cleaned her and placed her with her brother. 2. Sarah counted, checking Zara's gums. They were still pale, but the foam had stopped. The charcoal was working. The IV fluids were helping. "You're doing it, girl. You're amazing." But the labor wasn't over. Sarah could feel another mass in the abdomen. "One more, Zara. Just one more." This one was different. The labor stalled. Zara was fading, her energy reserves depleted by the poison and the massive effort of the first 2 births. She stopped pushing. Her head lolled back onto the rug, her eyes closing. Her breathing slowed to a terrifying crawl. "No! No! No!" Sarah panicked, her heart hammering. "Zara, stay with me! You have to push. Don't you dare quit on me." Sarah pressed her hands against the lioness's flank, trying to stimulate the contraction. Come on! David wouldn't give up on you, and I won't either. Zara groaned, a sound of deep, exhaustion-soaked suffering. She opened her eyes, looked at Sarah, and gave one final weak heave. The third cub slid out. Sarah's heart stopped. The cub was small, much smaller than the others. A runt, and it was blue. Limp. Silent. It lay in Sarah's hands like a wet rag. No movement, no cry, no breath. Zara sensed it. She stopped licking the other two cubs and let out a sound that Sarah would never forget as long as she lived. A low, mournful keen, a sound of pure, maternal anguish that transcended language. It was the sound of a heart breaking. No. Sarah gritted her teeth. A fire ignited in her chest. She remembered the day David had lost a rhino calf. He had sat on the ground and wept, his hands covered in blood. She would not weep. Not yet. Not on my watch. She growled. She grabbed a rough towel and began to rub the tiny cub vigorously, trying to spark the nerves. Breathe! Damn it, breathe! Nothing. The head flopped to the side. The tiny ribcage was still. Sarah didn't hesitate. She lifted the tiny blue muzzle to her face. The smell of birth and musk filled her nose. She covered the cub's nose and mouth with her own mouth. She breathed. A gentle, controlled puff of air. She watched the tiny chest rise. She pulled back to let the air escape, then breathed again. 1, 2, 3. She used 2 fingers to compress the tiny chest. Pump, pump, pump. She could feel the fragile ribs under her fingertips. Come on, she whispered against the wet fur. Come on, little one. Fight. Minutes ticked by. The only sounds were the storm raging outside, the rasping breath of Zara, and the soft whoosh of Sarah breathing life into the cub. Her arms ached. Her lungs burned. Her knees were raw from the rug. Please, she begged. Please. She thought of the nursery they had painted yellow and then painted over in white when the doctor gave them the news. She thought of the silence of this house. She thought of all the life that hadn't happened. She gave one large breath, a desperate transfer of her own will to live. Under her fingers, the tiny rib cage gave a spasmodic jerk. Sarah froze. The cub gasped. It was a wet, ragged sound, a tiny cough, but it was the sweetest sound Sarah had ever heard. The cub coughed again, expelling fluid, and then a thin, angry squeak erupted from its throat. The cub squirmed. The blue tint began to fade, replaced by the pink flush of oxygenated blood. Sarah collapsed back onto her heels, sobbing. Great, heaving sobs of relief shook her body. She was laughing and crying at the same time, wiping her face with her forearm. She crawled forward and placed the runt, a male, right under Zara's chin. Look, Sarah wept, her voice thick with emotion. Look at him. He's a fighter, just like his mom. Zara began to lick the runt. She purred, a sound that started deep in her chest and rumbled through the floor, vibrating into Sarah's knees. It was a sound of gratitude, a sound of peace. Sarah sat there for a long time, watching the miracle on her rug. The storm outside was beginning to break, the thunder rolling away into the distance like a retreating army. As she reached over to clean up the afterbirth and check Zara one last time, something caught her eye. It wasn't meat, but a flash of unnatural color wedged deep in the gum line, behind the molars. It was festering, the tissue around it angry and swollen. Sarah carefully reached in, risking her fingers, and worked the object loose. It was a wire. A small, twisted loop of blue-coated copper wire. Sarah held the wire up to the lantern light. Her tears dried instantly, replaced by a cold, hard rage. She knew this wire. It was distinct. An industrial copper wire used for electrical fencing, likely stolen from the old mines in the north. It was the material used in the snares of Jacob Venter. He was notorious for them, but usually he retrieved them before anyone could find them. This one must have snapped off when Zara bit at the bait, embedding itself in her gum. It was a fingerprint. It was indisputable proof. Jacob Venter was a name that made every ranger in the district spit with disgust. He was a commercial poacher, a man who didn't kill for survival, but for the black market trade in bones and skins. He was slippery, cruel, and until now, a ghost. He operated in the shadows, leaving poison and snares, but never leaving evidence. But this time, he had made a mistake. He had poisoned Zara. And Zara had brought the evidence directly to Sarah's living room floor. Sarah clenched the wire in her fist until it bit into her palm. "You messed with the wrong family, Jacob," she whispered into the dim light, her voice hard as steel. "You messed with the wrong family." The storm raged until noon, turning the world into a gray wash of water and violence. Sarah stayed by the lions, monitoring every breath, every twitch. By 1300 hours, the rain stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The sun broke through, a fierce, hot eye that began to steam the water from the earth. Sarah tried the radio again. "Base, this is Outpost 4. Do you copy?" "Outpost 4. We read you loud and clear." The voice of Marcus Thabo, the head of the anti-poaching unit, crackled back. "Sarah, we've been trying to reach you all morning." The storm took out the repeater tower. "I have a situation, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice calm now. "I have Zara here. She was poisoned with eldecarb. She's stable and she has 3 cubs. But Marcus, I have evidence, physical evidence." "We're coming," Marcus said immediately. "The roads are washed out. It's going to take us hours to get the trucks through the mud. Sit tight." "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah replied. The waiting was the hardest part. For the next 4 hours, Sarah watched the slow drying of the land. She drank stale coffee and watched the cubs sleep. She cleaned the blood from the rug. She felt a strange peace settling over her, a feeling she hadn't recognized in years. It was late afternoon, close to 1700 hours, when the convoy of Land Rovers finally splashed through the remaining mud and pulled up to the outpost. The sun was dipping low, casting long golden shadows across the bush. Marcus was the first out of the vehicle. He was a giant of a man, with a gentle face that hardened into stone when it came to poachers. He ran up the steps, his boots caked in red mud. What he found stopped him dead in the doorway. Sarah was sitting in her armchair. On the rug, sleeping peacefully, was Zara. Curled against her belly were 3 cubs, balls of tawny fluff rising and falling with their mother's breath. "Sarah," Marcus whispered, taking off his hat. I don't believe it." "Believe it, Marcus," Sarah said softly. She stood up, careful not to wake the sleeping family. Her movements were stiff, her body aching from the night's exertion, but her eyes were bright. She walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside lay the twisted blue wire. She handed it to Marcus. Her eyes were hard as flint. "This is Jacob Venter," she said. "That's his wire. Zara came from the northern ridge. That's where his camp is. He's there right now, Marcus, waiting for the vultures to circle so he can collect his kill. He doesn't know she survived." Marcus took the bag. He looked at the wire, then at the lioness, then at Sarah. He nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. "We've been trying to pin him for 2 years. This ties him directly to a protected species crime. With the GPS data from Zara's collar, we can triangulate exactly where she picked this up." "Go get him, Marcus," Sarah said. "Burn it down." "We will," Marcus promised. He signaled to the vet team waiting outside to come in quietly. "You did good, Sarah. David would be proud. Hell, the whole reserve is going to be proud." Sarah looked at the lions. "Just make sure he never hurts another one." The vet team moved in with hushed efficiency. They administered antidotes to ensure the poison was fully flushed from Zara's system and checked the cubs. They were healthy. Even the runt, whom Sarah had mentally named Hope, was suckling vigorously, his tiny paws kneading his mother's belly. While the vets worked, the radio crackled with updates from Marcus, who had deployed a tactical team immediately. They found the camp. They found Jacob Venter. He had been caught unaware, still waiting for the storm to fully clear. The blue wire was everywhere. The raid was successful. The ring was dismantled. Justice had been swift, guided by the instinct of a poisoned lioness and the determination of a widow. But the story wasn't over. Zara was too weak to be released back into the wild immediately. Her muscles were still recovering from the neurotoxin, and the cubs were too new. For the next 2 weeks, Sarah's life became a surreal dream. The wildlife authorities agreed to let Zara recover in the large, high-fenced enclosure that surrounded the back of the outpost, a relic from the days when David used to rehabilitate injured cheetahs. Sarah became a guardian to the pride. She would sit on her back porch in the evenings, watching Zara regain her strength. She watched the lioness teach her cubs to walk, to pounce, to play. The silence of the last 5 years was filled with the chirps, growls, and clumsy tumbles of the cubs. The emptiness of her days was filled with purpose. She found herself bonding specifically with Hope. The little male was fearless. While his siblings hid behind Zara's legs at the sight of humans, Hope would wobble over to the fence where Sarah sat. He would stare at her with bright, curious eyes, letting out tiny growls that sounded more like squeaks. Sarah would reach her fingers through the chain link, and he would bat at them with clumsy paws. Sarah would talk to him, her voice low and steady. "You're going to be a king one day," she would tell him. "You're going to run this valley. You fought death to be here. Don't you ever forget that." It was a strange, beautiful domesticity. A widow and a lioness, raising their children together. The grief that had defined Sarah's life began to recede, replaced by the simple, demanding joy of life. But the wild calls to the wild. The day came when the vet gave the all-clear. Zara was hunting crickets in the grass, her muscles rippling with returned power. Her coat had regained its luster. She was ready. Sarah opened the heavy steel gates that led out to the open reserve. She stood by the lever, her heart heavy. She didn't want them to go. She wanted to keep this moment frozen in amber forever. But she knew she couldn't. Love was letting go. "Go on, Zara," she called out softly. "You're free." Zara walked through the gate. She sniffed the air, the scent of freedom, of prey, of territory, calling to her. Her 2 larger cubs trotted after her, disappearing into the tall grass. But then she stopped. Zara turned around. She looked back at the house. She looked at Sarah. She let out a low chuff, a sound of greeting and affection. Then she did something that made the vet team, watching from their jeeps at a distance, gasp in disbelief. She walked over to Hope, who was lagging behind, distracted by a butterfly. She picked him up gently by the scruff of his neck. She walked back towards Sarah. Sarah stood frozen, her hand on the gate. Zara stopped 10 feet away. She lowered her head and placed Hope on the ground. She nudged him forward with her nose, toward Sarah. It was a clear, unmistakable gesture. "This is yours. You saved him. He is part of you." Sarah fell to her knees in the dust. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. She reached out a hand, and the little cub stepped forward and licked her fingers, his tongue rough like sandpaper, his motor purring loudly. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to the lioness. "Thank you, sister." Zara held her gaze for a long moment, a moment of profound understanding between 2 mothers who had saved each other. Then she picked up her son, turned, and vanished into the gold of the bush. 6 months later, the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and violet. The heat of the day was bleeding out of the earth. Sarah sat on her porch, the coffee mug in her hands. The outpost was quiet again, but it was no longer empty. The silence wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. She wasn't just the lonely widow at the end of the road anymore. The village nearby called her the Lion Mother. The poachers avoided her sector like the plague, fearing the woman who commanded the beasts. Sarah looked toward the tree line, as she did every evening. And there they were. Emerging from the shadows like ghosts, 4 shapes appeared. Zara, sleek, and powerful. And 3 adolescent lions, growing fast, their manes just beginning to sprout on the males. They didn't come to the house. They didn't need to. They simply sat at the edge of the clearing, watching her. They were guarding her, just as she had guarded them. One of them, the smallest male, stepped forward. He sat on his haunches, his golden eyes locked on Sarah. He let out a soft, rumbling call. Sarah raised her mug in a silent toast. She felt David beside her, his hand on her shoulder, warm and reassuring. She felt the beat of her own heart, strong and full. "To family," Sarah whispered into the twilight. "To family." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the world in fire and gold, Sarah smiled, finally whole. She was part of the pride. If this powerful story moved you, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another epic tale of courage, adventure, and the extraordinary world of lions. Share this video with a friend who would love this story.